20 billion. That is, the total number of individual survival crackers the United States government had manufactured and physically distributed by the time its Civil Defense Biscuit program formally wound down in 1964. 20 billion individual crackers, baked by two of the largest food companies in America, sealed into airtight metal tins and trucked into the basements of schools, city halls, apartment buildings, and office towers across the entire country, all built around a single grim assumption that nuclear war was a real enough possibility that the federal government needed to prepare in advance a food supply capable of keeping a meaningful fraction of the American population alive underground for 2 weeks at a time, without warning, without refrigeration, and without spoiling for years on end while it waited quietly in the dark for a war that everyone sincerely hoped would never actually come. Subscribe to Historia Survival and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because this is the story of the United States government's most literal attempt to answer the question of what keeps a person alive when the entire world above ground has become unsafe, and it produced one of the strangest, most quietly ambitious food engineering projects in American history. The story begins in the tension of the late 1950s and early 1960s, a period when the Cold War's once abstract threat of nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union suddenly felt uncomfortably concrete to millions of ordinary Americans. The 1961 Berlin crisis, in which Soviet and American tanks faced off directly, gun barrels pointed at one another across the newly divided city, pushed public anxiety about nuclear war to a level the country had not experienced before. And President Kennedy's administration responded with a nationwide civil defense push, urging Americans to build home fallout shelters and, at the federal level, launching a massive program to identify and stock existing buildings, primarily basements with sufficiently thick concrete or masonry walls, as public fallout shelters capable of protecting large numbers of people from radioactive fallout in the event of a nuclear detonation. Identifying suitable shelter space, however, solved only half the problem. A concrete basement could protect people from radiation, but it could do nothing to feed them, and civil defense planners quickly confronted an uncomfortable engineering question. What do you actually put in a shelter meant to keep potentially dozens or hundreds of people alive for up to 2 weeks, the estimated period during which the most dangerous fallout would decay to safer levels, in a space with no refrigeration, no reliable power, and no guarantee of resupply from outside? If you are already sensing the scale of the challenge, subscribe to Historia Survival, because the solution the government landed on reveals exactly how seriously this problem was taken at the highest levels of federal planning. Now stay with me. The federal government's answer was to design a single, standardized food product from scratch, one built entirely around the specific constraints of underground shelter storage. It needed to remain edible and nutritionally useful for at least 5 years without refrigeration. It needed to be dense enough in calories to sustain a person doing minimal physical activity in a cramped shelter. It needed to be cheap enough to produce and distribute at a truly massive national scale, and it needed to survive years of temperature swings inside an unheated, unventilated basement without developing mold, rancidity, or infestation. The product that emerged from this set of requirements was a simple, dense, all-purpose survival cracker built primarily around Bulgur wheat rather than the refined white flour that dominated ordinary American baked goods of the era. The choice of Bulgur was deliberate and, by the standards of 1960s American food science, unusually well-researched. Bulgur, a parboiled, dried, and cracked wheat product with a long history of use across the Middle East, Mediterranean, and parts of Central Asia, offered a specific combination of properties that made it exceptionally well-suited to long-term storage. Its parboiling process denatures certain enzymes that would otherwise cause fats and proteins in raw wheat to degrade over time, giving it a substantially longer stable shelf life than ordinary flour, while its cracked, partially cooked form allowed it to be baked into a dense biscuit without requiring the extensive milling and processing that refined flour production demanded. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Vischer, testifying before Congress in 1962 to defend the program's funding and its unusual ingredient choice, pointed out that bulgur had already served as the primary subsistence grain for large populations across the world for thousands of years, a track record of proven, low-tech reliability that made it a sensible foundation for a product that needed to work under the worst possible circumstances. Prepared by untrained civilians with no access to modern kitchen equipment, the exact formulation the government settled on reflected a careful, if unglamorous, balancing act between competing priorities. Nutritionists working on the project needed the cracker to deliver enough calories and protein to keep a sedentary adult functioning through 2 weeks of confinement. But they also needed to hold total daily volume down to a modest ration that could be packed densely into a 5-pound tin without the product becoming so calorie-dense that it spoiled faster or became prohibitively expensive to manufacture at the billions of units scale the program required. The final recipe combined bulgur wheat with vegetable shortening, a modest amount of sugar and salt, baked into a hard, dense biscuit, deliberately engineered to be unappetizing in the specific way that discouraged people from treating it as a snack food to be nibbled through casually rather than a genuine emergency ration meant to be rationed carefully across an uncertain, unknown number of days. The federal government did not attempt to manufacture this product itself. Instead, in a decision that reflected both the scale of the undertaking and the existing industrial capacity available in the American food sector, the Pentagon contracted with major commercial biscuit and cracker manufacturers, most prominently Nabisco, and the United Biscuit Company of America, the parent company that would later become known simply as Keebler, to design, formulate, and mass-produce the survival cracker according to government specifications. These were not small or marginal companies. They were, at the time, among the largest and most technically sophisticated baked goods manufacturers in the United States, with production lines already capable of turning out packaged crackers and cookies at a scale most food companies could not match. And the federal government essentially rented that existing industrial capacity to solve a national security problem. Drop a comment if you are still here, and subscribe to Historia Survival so the next one reaches you. because the production numbers that followed are almost impossible to picture without seeing the actual scale laid out. Beginning around December 1961, these manufacturers ramped up production at a pace that, within roughly 2 years, delivered enough crackers to theoretically feed 50 million people. By the time the program concluded in 1964, cumulative production had surpassed 20 billion individual crackers, packed into sealed, waterproof 5-pound metal tins designed specifically to resist moisture, pests, and the years of unattended storage that shelter stockpiles would require. Each tin was engineered as a self-contained unit. Airtight seams, a pull tab or key opening mechanism similar to contemporary canned goods, and a design specifically intended to remain sealed and untouched for years at a stretch, opened only in the event that the shelter it was stored in was actually needed. Distribution of the finished tins was itself a logistical undertaking on a scale that mirrored the manufacturing effort. Federal civil defense officials worked with state and local governments across the country to survey buildings for suitable shelter space, typically basements or sub-basements with sufficient overhead concrete and surrounding earth or masonry to provide meaningful radiation shielding. And once a building was designated and marked with the now iconic yellow and black fallout shelter sign, trucks delivered the calculated quantity of ration tins, water storage drums, sanitation kits, and medical supplies needed to support the building's estimated shelter capacity for the standard 2-week planning period. Schools became one of the single largest categories of designated public shelters, in part because their basements were often already reinforced for structural reasons, and in part because school buildings existed in nearly every American community, giving the program a built-in distribution network that did not require constructing new infrastructure from scratch. This entire production and distribution effort did not happen in a vacuum of untested assumptions. Before committing to full-scale deployment, the federal government wanted direct, physical evidence that human beings could actually survive on this ration for the full duration a real shelter stay might require, and it turned to one of the few institutions with the facilities and the personnel to run such a test safely: the United States Navy. In a controlled study conducted at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, a group of Navy volunteers was confined and fed exclusively on the civil defense shelter ration, including the Bulgur survival crackers, for a full 2-week period meant to simulate exactly the kind of shelter confinement the crackers were designed for. Researchers monitored the sailors' weight, general health, and morale throughout the test, looking specifically for the kind of nutritional deficiencies or psychological deterioration that might emerge from 2 straight weeks of a monotonous, calorie-restricted, confined diet. The test provided the government with real physiological data, rather than theoretical nutritional calculations alone, confirming that the ration could sustain healthy adults through the exact duration the entire shelter program was built around. Even if the sailors' own accounts of the experience, unsurprisingly, described the food itself as bland and repetitive well before the 2 weeks were over, the Bethesda feeding trial deserves a closer look because it represents one of the more genuinely rigorous pieces of applied nutritional science the Civil Defense Program produced. standing in contrast to some of the more theoretical or improvisational planning that characterized other aspects of Cold War preparedness. Navy researchers did not simply hand volunteers a stack of crackers and check on them 2 weeks later. They tracked body weight at regular intervals throughout the confinement period, monitored blood chemistry for signs of nutritional deficiency, and conducted psychological assessments designed to detect the kind of morale decline or cognitive fog that might emerge from a diet that was calorically adequate but relentlessly monotonous, a factor the researchers understood mattered as much to a shelter's actual survival prospects as the raw nutrition numbers on a spec sheet. The volunteers, all healthy adult sailors, selected specifically because their baseline fitness would make any decline attributable to the ration itself, rather than some pre-existing health issue, completed the full 2-week trial with their weight and general health within the range the program's planners had hoped for, giving officials genuine physiological confidence, rather than theoretical confidence, that the ration could do what it was designed to do. For several years following the program's peak, these tins sat largely untouched in the basements of thousands of American schools, government buildings, and apartment complexes, a quiet, largely forgotten layer of Cold War infrastructure that most of the people walking above them in classrooms and offices had no particular reason to think about on any given day. The geopolitical tension that had justified the program's creation gradually eased through the middle and later 1960s, and public attention, along with federal funding priorities, shifted toward other concerns, from the escalating war in Vietnam to a wave of domestic social and political upheaval that dominated headlines through the rest of the decade. If you want to see how this story ends, and it does not end the way most Cold War infrastructure programs end, subscribe to Historia Survival, because these tins had a much stranger second life than anyone in 1962 could have predicted, as decades passed and the shelters themselves were gradually forgotten, converted to other uses, or simply left unmaintained as buildings changed ownership and purpose. Many of the original supply tins remained exactly where they had been placed, undisturbed in sub-basements and storage rooms that nobody had any reason to enter. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing sporadically for decades afterward, building superintendents, renovation crews, and historical preservationists doing unrelated maintenance or demolition work began stumbling across intact caches of civil defense supplies, crackers, medical kits, water storage drums, sometimes decades after anyone still working in the building had any memory the shelter program had ever existed there at all. These rediscoveries became local news curiosities in city after city, a strange, slightly eerie encounter with a very literal, very physical piece of a historical anxiety that had otherwise faded almost entirely from public memory. Tins of food sealed by companies and government agencies preparing for a catastrophe that, in the buildings where they were found, had simply never come. One particularly well-documented rediscovery, cited repeatedly in later historical accounts of the program, involved a school district maintenance crew that opened a long-sealed sub-basement storage room. Decades after the shelter designation had been forgotten by everyone still working in the building, only to find the original stack of civil defense supply tins sitting exactly where delivery crews had stacked them in the early 1960s, dust-covered but structurally intact, their seals apparently having held for the better part of a human lifetime. Curious staff who pried open a tin generally reported that the crackers inside had, unsurprisingly given their design purpose, survived the decades in a physically intact but thoroughly unappetizing state, dense and stale beyond any reasonable eating, a first-hand confirmation that the packaging engineering had worked exactly as intended, even if nobody had ever actually needed to rely on the food inside during an actual emergency. Municipal governments, once these forgotten stockpiles resurfaced, generally treated them as a disposal problem rather than a preservation opportunity. Most surviving tins, by the time they were rediscovered decades later, had long since passed any reasonable estimate of safe shelf life, and cities typically arranged for their contents to be disposed of through standard waste channels, while occasionally preserving individual tins, intact and unopened, as historical artifacts for local museums or civil defense history collections, rather than as food anyone still intended to eat. A small number of these tins survive today in museum displays dedicated to Cold War civil defense history, sealed and unopened, presented not as curiosities of outdated food science, but as physical evidence of just how seriously an entire generation of American planners treated the practical logistics of surviving a war that, thankfully, never happened. The broader public memory of the Civil Defense Shelter Program has always carried a strange emotional duality that later generations often find difficult to fully appreciate. On one hand, the program represented a genuinely rational, evidence-based response to a real and terrifying geopolitical threat, backed by actual nutritional testing, actual industrial-scale manufacturing, and actual federal coordination across thousands of communities. On the other hand, the entire undertaking has become, in popular retrospect, something closer to dark comedy, a symbol of Cold War paranoia and the sometimes absurd lengths to which mid-century American planners went in an effort to make an unsurvivable catastrophe feel survivable through sufficiently thorough preparation. Both readings are, in their own way, historically accurate. The Bulgur cracker program was simultaneously a serious, well-researched piece of applied food science and a monument to the peculiar psychological need of an entire nation to believe that enough careful planning could make nuclear war into something. You could simply wait out in a basement with the right supplies, provided the supplies had been stockpiled thoroughly enough in advance. The deeper cultural afterlife of the shelter biscuit concept, however, did not end with rediscovered tins in museum cases. It survived in a form few people connect back to Cold War civil defense planning, in the ordinary pantries of Alaska, where a related product called pilot bread has remained a genuine, beloved household staple for generations, entirely independent of any government shelter program. Pilot bread, a simple, dense, long shelf-life cracker with roots stretching back to 19th century maritime and Arctic provisioning, rather than Cold War planning specifically, occupies a place in rural and native Alaskan households today that closely mirrors the exact logic civil defense planners applied decades earlier. A food that can sit in a cupboard or a cabin pantry for months or years, In a state with genuinely limited road access, unpredictable weather, and long stretches of the year when a resupply trip to the nearest grocery store may simply not be possible. Grocery stores across rural and coastal Alaska today stockpile bread as a routine staple item, restocked continuously alongside ordinary bread and cereal rather than tucked away in some separate emergency preparedness aisle. And Alaskans buy it by the case, not as an occasional emergency afterthought, but as a genuinely routine grocery habit, a direct cultural echo of the same underlying survival logic that filled millions of civil defense tins with Bulgur crackers half a century earlier, proving that the core idea behind the shelter biscuit, a simple, dense, nearly indestructible food that outlasts uncertainty, never actually needed a nuclear war to justify its continued place on a kitchen shelf. The next time you see a rusted tin of hardtack in a museum case, a sleeve of modern military-issue crackers, or a case of ordinary pilot bread sitting on an Alaskan grocery shelf between the cereal and the canned goods, understand exactly what you are looking at. The direct living descendant of a federal program that once mobilized two of America's largest food companies, 20 billion individual crackers, and a 2-week Navy feeding trial in Bethesda, all built around the same unglamorous but essential question that has driven food preservation since long before nuclear weapons existed. What exactly do you eat when the world outside your own front door becomes, for reasons entirely beyond your control, a place you cannot safely leave for weeks at a time?